G'day, everybody. This is the Passive House Show, where we talk about all things passive. We're interviewing a special guest today by the name of Gord Cooke from Building Knowledge Canada. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you became to be involved in building knowledge.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. So Gord Cooke, Building Knowledge Canada. It started in the industry back in 1984, designing and building something called a heat recovery ventilator. Of course, back then, nobody knew what they were or what they did. But that was kind of my start, the early days. That was in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I ultimately was promoting and selling those products in Ontario. And when I started talking to builders about putting in heat recovery ventilators, they would say, "Why do I need that?" And I said, "Because you build tight houses." And they would say, "Do I?" And I said, I don't know. So I bought a blower door. At that time, Canada's flagship energy efficiency program was the R2000 program. So I started promoting it basically to try to sell more HRVs. And so I always had kind of this two sides, trying to sell innovative products into high performance houses, and two, trying to help builders build high performance homes. And started doing education training and blower door testing, validation. And so that's where Building Knowledge grew from. And now we're very pleased to work with a couple hundred builders building Energy Star, Lead for Homes, Net Zero, and some passive hosts as well, typically in Ontario. But then I get this amazing opportunity to travel, and I'm in both US and Canada. And in Canada, it's with a company called Construction Instruction, and a shameless plug, Mick, if you don't mind. There's a great learning center down in Denver where we've got 12 different wall sections, a little mini house built where builders can come down and see all of this stuff in practice and learn the science in depth. We've had many passive house folks there to kind of share resources, if you will. So that's my background, and just to say, pleased to work with a couple hundred builders, helping them build more efficient houses.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your time designing heat recovery ventilators? Is that right?
Yes. That's right. Designing and building, it was a very small company, so everybody did everything. There was only 7 or 8 employees, but working with the owner, and the brand name was Van E, and big tall Dutch guy by the name of Dick Van E was the original designer. And so I worked with Dick and his partner Rick Olmsted. So and we were just building that brand name and creating the standards around it, which is I think interesting. At that time, there was no standard as to the performance. We all used to claim we were 102% efficient and cured everything from MS to who knows what, but breathing problems. And then out of that, Rick Olmsted, the owner, was very forward thinking and actually went to Natural Resources Canada, at that time Energy Mines and Resources, and said, you really should have a standard, and help the industry create the CSA standard, what's called C439, which is the test standard used in Canada to measure the performance of and validate the performance of heat recovery ventilators. And that actually has some bearing in the Passive House program, because Passive House has its own test standard for HRVs coming out of Europe. And those standards don't exactly match the Canadian standards. And there's a little bit of tension there as to, so the product, here's test that's done, $50,000 test done in Europe. Should Canada accept that test, or should they also have to go through the C439 testing, the Canadian testing? And we've been working a little bit, the industry's been working a little bit to get that resolved. I, of course, being here in Canada, having experience with that standard, would say probably should have products, if they're going to be installed in Canada, should be tested to Canadian standards. But I do recognize that the Passive House program and manufacturers would say, hey, our test standards are really good. It's no different than Canadians trying to sell products over in Europe, and the Europeans would say, well, you got to test to our standard. We would say probably European products should have to test to Canadian standards, but wouldn't it be nice if we had one international, or at least a harmonized standard that everybody recognized? So there is work being done on that, but it can be a little stressful, I know, for passive house builders. They may, in fact, get a little pushback from local building officials if they try to bring a product. And it's not only HRVs, it might be windows and others that haven't necessarily met Canadian standards.
All right, so I've got a couple of questions for you. How do you see the building industry's role in making positive social and environmental impacts for Canadians, aligning with your professional background and values?
That's obviously a big question.
Yeah.
But I will put it this way. Uh, the building industry, from my perspective, when I first started connecting directly with the building industry back in 1986, I was worried. What if the builders weren't interested and were just trying to make a buck? And it hasn't been my experience. My experience has been, I can honestly say, over 40 years, there's only been 3 or 4 people in the building industry that I wouldn't consider a friend. That they're all good folks. Now, it's a complicated industry, right? A very difficult industry when you think about the regional differences, the permitting, the weather, just any number of things. And so, do builders make mistakes? Absolutely. But do they want to do the right thing? And my experience has been yes. The minute you show them how to do it or teach them, and that's sounding a little bit pejorative, but once they are exposed to and see that there's better ways, they always move that way. Not, I mean, obviously there's budgets and builders will say, if homeowners would buy this, I would be happy to build it this way. They never seem to back away as long as there's a market. It could be done cost effectively. So I actually think builders are doing a pretty nice job. I can use an example. Canada's largest builder, Mattamy Homes, has undertaken a huge carbon analysis of their houses, carbon footprint analysis of their houses, and they're willing to share that information. The owner of the company, Peter Gilligan, has said, I want to share this information to make it easier for the building industry to do this, because we all have to work at this together. So we have this crisis, right? We have a housing affordability and supply crisis. And then we have an environmental climate change crisis. How do we square those two? How do we make sure that both get done at the same time? And so I feel like builders have done a good job. Even the Canadian Home Builders Association in 2015 took it upon themselves to say we should be promoting net zero houses, net zero energy houses as a option, not necessarily as a standard, but at least show that what can be done. So I feel like the industry's doing a pretty nice job. Should we move quicker? Sure. But the industry's not easy. Codes have to change, and codes are on a 5-year cycle. So even if builders want to do things, they have to follow code. So I feel like the industry's in a good place, doing the right job. To my mind, it's all about education and training. It shows the complexity of the industry. It's so difficult to change the industry. I can give you an example. Just the other day, my son is having a renovation done on his house, tearing apart, actually adding a little bathroom to an age-old house. House isn't in great shape, but he's adding a bathroom. He's asking them to use a spray foam insulation on the exterior walls. And both the building official, an older fellow, and perhaps more importantly, the younger contractor, both said to him, "Oh, you don't want to make a house too tight. That's house got to breathe." So after all this time, after all this education, to somehow indicate that there's a problem that of making houses tight, where you and I would know, no, tight is a good thing. Tight is exactly what you want. So, and those are well-meaning people doing good work, but they just haven't been exposed, I guess, to the right information. How do we get them in a classroom? How do we get them to understand that the science behind houses?
It's really cool to hear that builders themselves are taking the initiative to push forward to the net zero standard that's coming. And like you said, it is difficult. Like we hear it all the time. Sometimes with carpenters that we hire, sometimes, we get these journeyman carpenters coming in. They've been building stock standard code built homes for quite a while. And, they get to the drywall stage of the house. We go visit them, see how things are going. And they sit there and they just keep saying, man, this is overkill. This is overkill. Like the house doesn't need to be this tight, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, we're a passive house building company for starters. Um, but then once we put the heating system in and show them what's what, they're like, oh, what? Like, you know what I mean? But then all of a sudden it all starts making sense because they built the damn thing. And
Right.
yeah, it's kind of hilarious.
It is interesting, isn't it, that idea of overkill, what we needed in 1941 when the first building code was built, and what we needed in 82 when the R2000 program was started, and what do we need now? And I always liked the passive house approach. I was just working with a passive house builder on the sales side of the equation. How would I sell this? And understanding that when passive house looks at this, they look at this house is going to last 2, 3, 400 years. And in fact,
Exactly.
this happened to be in Guelph, Ontario, and the oldest house in Guelph, it's one of the oldest communities in Canada. There's 300-year-old houses in Guelph. And so when people say it's overkill, well, wait a minute. That if that old house lasted 300 years, how long do you think this house is going to last? So should we not be putting this in now? Because to do it later is impossible because those 300-year-old houses, impossible to renovate to get them anywhere close. So let's think about that. I think it's the one thing that, well, one of the major things that I like about passive is this focus on houses are going to last a long time. And it's not about the first owner. It's about passing this house over and thinking about somebody's going to drive by here or fly by here 300 years from now and go, oh, those guys did it right. I think that's an interesting area of focus to get people thinking about this house isn't just for you. It's
Mm.
about for generations of families. And I think that's an interesting focus. We're seeing at MIC too, the question comes up about, well, the embodied carbon of the insulation that you put on the walls, is there going to be a return on the carbon invested? And it was one of the most interesting pieces of work that we've done of recent is with this Mattamy Homes and other builders who are doing the same and realizing that actually, no, it's the operational carbon still that's the biggest hit over 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years. And so adding extra insulation. Now, is there a spot at which you would say, yes, that's 100 years or that's 150 years and that's too long? Yes, but at least now we have that measure. I get this all the time. Triple glazed windows, that extra pane of glass is too much carbon. No, it's a 2-year payback on carbon invested in Ontario, for example, in any cold place in Canada. That third pane of glass, it pays for itself in terms of the carbon that was invested to make it, pays for itself in 2 to 3 years in terms of the reduction in operational carbon. And those kinds of, we can now make those kinds of calculations and get a good sense of what exactly is the sweet spot. Yet another, I guess, calculation of what is too much. And embodied carbon is a new metric, a relatively new metric that makes sense. I was pleased to, I couldn't travel, but I was pleased to participate in the PASFOS FIAS conference in the US, where we presented the relative value of air tightness from a carbon perspective, specifically the technology AeroBarrier, which is this aerosolized air sealing methodology. And that methodology, there's, it's a couple of gallons of this material that can seal a house, and the embodied carbon associated with that small amount of material and the impact it has, the carbon reduction, it's instantaneous. Just amazing when the air tightness of passive houses absolutely makes sense. The first month, if you will, it's a single month payback, right? In terms of carbon invested on the carbon side. It just makes a lot of sense.
All right. So you mentioned when it comes to builders, moving forward and wanting to move forward, were you saying that there was a bit of pushback sometimes because the code is a 5-year cycle? That can be a deterrent, right? Like,
Absolutely. Well, codes are a wonderful thing. We have one of the best building codes in the world here in Canada, and it's a great thing. It helps normalize and helps set a minimum bar. The problem is it's a minimum bar for builders who want to go beyond, want to bring in new technologies and so on. Hey, that's not in the code yet, and maybe you have to wait or have to get special acceptance. I would say it's just one of the complexities. I wouldn't even call it a barrier. It's one of the complexities, right? Of how do I get this done? It's no different than saying, hey, I want to go all electric, and the local electrical utility going, yeah, we're not ready for that. There are builders now who would like to do all electric communities, but in their local community, the transformers, whatever, generating capacity just aren't there at the local utility level. So it's code and acceptance of new materials, standards, and so on are just yet another complexity. The building industry, for a bunch of reasons, is highly regulated. It's a highly regulated. I mean, rightly so, right? It's life safety on the occupants. So we have a lot of regulation. Then we have a very regional industry. That is I always say if we took the best building practices from across the country, we'd have ourselves one heck of a house. But the way we do basements in Ontario is different than the way they do them in Calgary or Minnesota. So it's a very regional business, and that adds complexity. So it's a very complex industry for a builders. One builder said to me one day, he said, I'm tired of being a leading builder. I said, what do you mean? He says, it feels like I'm always bleeding. I'm the bleeding edge. He said, I'd rather be a leaning builder. I said, what do you mean leaning builder? He said, I'd rather wait and let a few other people do it, then kind of lean in, have a look at what they're doing and copy it. And because he said, it just takes so much time and effort. Doug Terry, some will know that name, Doug Terry Construction down in St. Thomas. They've just been groundbreaking all the way along, largest net zero builder. There you are in St. Thomas, large net zero energy builder in the country, as I recall right now, and just done so many houses. And yet Doug would say, is it just me? Am I the first one to do this? Is anybody else having this problem? And he's got a building official that's very open. Like the building official comes to every training session, and then there's a building official from the city that's very open to these conversations. So at least that part of the equation, he's and it's not as if he's doing anything untoward. It's just the building official's willing to listen to new information and think about how it fits into code. They're not letting him away with anything, but at least they're educated and understand what he's trying to do and how that fits into current code. So in short, it's a complex industry, and I feel for your Passivos colleagues, because you guys are trying to do new things, new materials, new methods at very high levels. And although it's all great stuff, I'm sure there is pushback from locals.
Yeah, mostly it's subcontractors. I remember I went to a project that is 95% built. There's some few interior stuff that needs to be sorted out, but I went there to film for right after the exterior siding had been put on, and it was just a siding team. And I got there, and even they were just like, this, it looks good, but it's overkill, and again, it's just like we have a good solid team of carpenters and builders and laborers with us that are actually, for the most part, the younger crew that have just joined. Like we find that now our newest recruits actually have an interest in passive house.
Nice.
More and more and more. So I've been there for about nearly 3-4 years now, and I started with them as a carpenter, and I was swinging a hammer for them for like 3 months before I realized what we were really building, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is an amazing house. Like, this is an amazing house this is the best house that I know of to build. Again, this thing's going to last for 300-400 years. And the comparison going from building stock standard homes to houses without holes in them, basically, was just mind blowing to me. And I just thought, we need to get this out into the world. So it's been an interesting journey, learning about it, but also watching some of the older people, not the older people, but the older carpenters come in that they're just looking for work, but then they realize what we're building. And it's like, at first, a lot of them are, the pushback is like, well, this is ridiculous. This is too much.
Right.
And then it's like, yeah, but we don't have furnaces. We don't have gas. It's, the electricity we do use is very minimal, like as much as possible. And it's like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense for Canada, and a lot of other places too. So,
And I'm
yeah.
obviously, to my mind, I'm a trainer, I'm an educator, so I want I want butts in the seats. I'd like to be training and educating. And again, I'll say, once they're trained, I find they're very open. It's, they come in arms crossed, but I'll go to this CI level experience center in Denver. It's a 50-seat classroom out front, and then 11,000 square foot warehouse where we can roll out 12 different wall sections and show different things. And it's experiential learning, and builders who come to it, and they'll sometimes bring their contractors. They start off in the morning, as I say, arms folded, I don't know. And then we take them out back and we show them. And by the end of 2 days, they're completely changing their thoughts as to what's doable, what's practical. So I'm a big fan of education. Homeowners always ask me, how do I find a good contractor? Well, one question you should ask is, how many hours did they spend in a classroom this year? Because in today's world, as you know, the materials you guys are using, the changes in code, it's just no way to do this unless, and it's not days and days and days of training. It's 45 minutes once a week, or a couple times. I always say at least 45 minutes once every 3 months. And the best builders are, in fact, requiring or encouraging their trade contractors to take that training, and to say you can't say yes or no on this until you've heard the science, the why behind it, and then look at how that's applied. So I'm a huge fan of education, and it doesn't take a lot. I'm reminded of, I was out at a job site. We often do what I'll call the contractor dance when you first meet somebody. Oh, who do you know? Who have you worked with? And so on and so on. And this is a really nice guy. He'd come, stayed late. So, he's committed. He's been doing insulation on houses. He and his crew of three of them, been insulating houses for over 20 years. And he said, you don't need to tell me about insulation. I know everything there is to know about insulation. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Tell me a little bit about that. And he said, 2 things I know for sure. I said, okay. Yeah, it doesn't matter how you cram this stuff in, it finds its own level over time. I'm like, whoa, what's the second thing you know for sure? And he said, well, you don't want to build a wall too tight. They tell you to caulk and tape every seam, but no, I leave a little gap in every bay to make sure there's some air movement. I'm like, wow. You've been doing this 20 years. You and I both have been in the same market, same geographical region for 20 years. We've never met each other. And unfortunately, you have some misconceptions. And would you come and do a little training session, which he did. In the end, he goes, oh my goodness, I've been doing it wrong all these years. I said, yeah. And just because he hadn't taken the opportunity to listen to I would say the new information. It's not that new. It's 40 years old. We've known this stuff for 40 years. PASFO's, right? 1988, not quite 40 years, but PASFO started in 88, our 2000 program in 82. These are like-minded programs that have been saying the same thing for over 40 years. And yet we've only scratched the surface of the number of contractors that we've been able to educate and influence. It's a complicated industry.
Let's talk about some metric stuff. Like, we speak to a lot of homeowners, or people that want to be homeowners, and passive house homeowners in particular. There's so many benefits to building passive. There's so many benefits to paying attention to building science and the new standards and the new ways and materials that you've been mentioning. Can you give us specific instances where applying building science principles led to great improvements in metrics such as reducing warranty and maintenance callbacks?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, isn't it? That our metrics before we build, what are the metrics? Obviously, structural, heating contents, airflow movement, air tightness. These are all things that we can define, or at least design for. Then what do we get out of that? Well, the energy side is fairly clear. We have pretty good metrics on, we know heat flow through walls, ceilings, floors, and so on. And so if we double the insulation, it cuts the heat flow in half. And, what does that do to your heating cooling bills? So there's really good numbers there. Then the question becomes, what else do I get out of this? I'll start with air tightness. We know, for example, air tightness is a big part of the energy equation, but frankly, that's not why air tightness was first put into the R2000 program and the PASFO's program. Air tightness was really to make sure that there would be not a significant amount of warm, moist air getting into cold cavities. And the more insulation you put in a cavity, the more airtight it needs to be to avoid condensation. And that, in fact, is measurable. That is, we have pretty good algorithms that would say What level of air tightness do you need to ensure that there's not going to be interstitial condensation? That's the metric of R2000 set it at 1.5. Pasvo set it at 0.6. Why is it tighter in Pasvos? Because you have higher levels of insulation. The more insulation, tighter you need to be. But we can also measure, say, in a southern climate or in a humid climate, that reduced air leakage, natural air infiltration in the summertime becomes vital for humidity control. Because I don't want warm, moist air, say off the lake in Ontario, to allow warm, moist air to get into the cavity. So knowing that air tightness number really allows me to design and manage humidity much better. If I went to the prairie provinces, now we're talking about over drying in houses. And if I know the air leakage, I can avoid the need for humidification equipment. Or if I am going to put in humidification, I can at least define how much humidity I need to put in. And humidity is critical from a health perspective, right? To maintain proper moisture levels, 40 to 60%, or at least the optimal zone, 40 to 60%. You can do that much better in a passive house or an R2000 house than you can or a zero energy house. You can do that much better than you can in a standard code built house, if you will. So those are important metrics and then you'd say, but do homeowners really notice it? Well, there was a study done years ago on specifically R2000 houses and how asthmatics did in those houses. And the study I don't think it's available anymore, but I recall the results that asthmatics used less of their inhaler medication in R2000 houses properly. And I can use that. Hopefully you don't mind. I keep using the term R2000. It's analogous to passive house. But when you have really good air tightness, really good ventilation, and really good humidity control, asthmatics do better. So good metrics there. There's been work to try to quantify the reduction in warranty and service. Most of that's anecdotal, but it is real. We know, in fact, the survey work was done by Avid, who's a surveying homeowners, JD Power at the time, and found that houses that ascribed to an energy efficiency label, whether it be Energy Star 2000 or passive house, people were more satisfied with their house. They had fewer customer complaints. Part of that was simply because they had a higher level of trust in the builder, so they didn't go looking for things. And second, because we would say because there were indeed less problems. So I don't know that I could point to a study that links specifically callbacks. But we know in general, or at least anecdotally, that high performance houses that work to a standard such as passive house, homeowners trust them more, and there are indeed fewer complaints or callbacks.
That's really cool to hear. That's really cool to hear, especially on the warranty sort of thing. I like what you said. It's anecdotal, but it is real. That's cool. We're running out of time. I know you've got to get going, but I'd love to get you back for a part two. I know we've got a lot much more to talk about, and everyone, you can stay tuned for part two when that comes out. Can you just give people a run through of where they can find out more information? I mean, this is building sciences. This is stuff you'll want to know if you're a homeowner wanting to build a house, whether it's R2000 or passive house or net zero, whatever, all those good things. Gord, let us know where to go to find all your information.
Sure. Pretty proud of our website. So that's buildingknowledge.ca. And it's got a video series of many of our sessions that we've done. We do webinars with Enbridge and others. And so many of those are online. Then I would also point you to constructioninstruction.com. And in fact, there's an app. It's the largest app in the construction industry. If you go to your favorite app store, look for construction instruction, CI, construction instruction. Our folks there, we have licensed architects and videographers who have animated much of the construction process. So it shows how to build a basement, shows how to flash a window. So I'd encourage folks to go either to the website, constructioninstruction.com, or download the app. As I say, I think we've had 180,000 downloads. There's about 80,000 people that use it regularly. It's just all free building science information. Yes, some of it's partnered with or sponsored with some manufacturers, but it's all just good building science information. So I'd really encourage that. And on either of those websites, look for the opportunities for training and education. We'd love to have folks come down to the center in Denver for a 2-day experience, a really hands-on, immersive 2-day building science, deep building science. We actually demonstrate heat flow, so we can show you conduction heat flow, radiant heat flow. We have all these little science experiments set up that really galvanizes your understanding of how things move in houses. So thanks for that opportunity to give those plugs.
Gord, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. I know it was a struggle to get this this podcast up and running, but thank you so much for your time and joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for part 2. There will be more coming from Gord Cooke. Leave a comment if you like this episode.